Hello, everyone, and welcome to the sixth installment of our series, Probing New Public Opinion Data for an Informed Response, where we at MassINC and the MassINC Polling Group examine public opinion research on distinct policy areas and explore measures that would address the impacts of COVID-19 and promote recovery. Last time, we looked at data from the MassINC Polling Group that illustrated the toll COVID-19 is taking on the Massachusetts Latino community. In previous forums, we've discussed the impacts in recovery in areas of K through 12 and higher education, small businesses, housing, and more. If you missed any of those, make sure to check out the MassINC YouTube channel where they all are still available. But today, we are taking a look at Massachusetts voters' opinion on state revenues and how public dollars should be invested. Amid a significant funding shortfall, state legislators must make difficult decisions. What will serve as revenue sources? Which government services take priority in receiving funding? The MassINC Polling Group surveyed Massachusetts voters on these questions, taking the temperature of the public on what they think about revenue sources, budget priorities, and more. I'm going to bring out the creator of the poll in just a moment. But before I do, I just want to remind everyone that we look forward to your participation throughout this presentation. In the bottom of the right-hand corner of your Zoom window, you will see a question and answer function. If you have questions along the way, please feel free to share your questions there. They may either get answered in real time in the question and answer box by MassINC Polling Group Research Director, Rich Parr, or they may be answered by our speakers during our question and answer section at the end of the event. Before we jump in with presentation, I first want to extend a heartfelt and profound thank you to the sponsors of the poll. Thank you to the Boston Foundation, the Himes Foundation, the Mass Budget and Policy Center, King Boston, Amplify Latinx, the Black Economic Council of Massachusetts, the Bridgewater State University Foundation, and the Massachusetts Municipal Association. Without your support, this poll would not have been possible, and we were really proud of the fact that we were able to get over samples of communities of color, and these sponsors made that possible, so thank you. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the engineer of this poll and the president of the MassINC Polling Group, Steve Koczela. Steve's going to lead us in a presentation on the findings. Welcome, Steve. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Juana. And I'd like to begin by echoing the sentiment that Juana expressed, thanking the sponsors of this survey. The survey, like many of the ones that we've done recently, did include oversamples of Black and Latino residents. And you'll see as we walk through the presentation that made a huge difference in terms of what we were able to uncover and how this poll can be interpreted and used by legislators, policymakers, and others as we move ahead. So I'm going to go ahead then and share my screen, which will then show a presentation. You should now be looking at a PowerPoint presentation called Budgets for the Days Ahead. Just a quick word about the survey. The survey was of 1,522 registered voters in Massachusetts. What that included was a base sample of 1,000 voters statewide. This was done both on the phone and online. And then we also did oversamples of Black and Latino voters. So for those who don't perhaps follow polling as closely as we all do here, what that basically means is when you do an ordinary sample of 1,000 voters, you would just get whatever the percentage is of each demographic group represented in the survey. So maybe 70 or 80 Black voters, 70 or 80 Latino voters. But what the survey sponsors enabled us to do in this one was basically to boost that up to 250 each. And you'll see that then that let us break down the results of the survey so that we could get a more fine-grained look at how Black voters and Latino voters are reacting to some of the issues that are covered in this survey. The survey was conducted in December, and it was done in English and in Spanish. And when you're looking at the results, you can interpret it as being representative of what voters statewide think and what the demographic groups that we break it down by also think. So we weighted the results to be representative of registered voters on the factors that you see listed here: gender, age, education, and region, and so forth. And just one more final hearty thank you to all of the sponsors that you see listed here for their support of this endeavor. So what did we find? The key findings here, and we'll get into some of the numbers behind all of this in just a second. The first thing is that there's a pretty extensive to-do list for state leaders. State leaders have just finished one budget and are headed into another. And as they do so, there's a lot of things that voters are interested in seeing happen. We looked at this both from the short-term perspective and from the long-term perspective, where we're talking both about emergency funding to deal with some of the most immediate and severe impacts of the pandemic, and then also looking forward to kind of what comes next and what the things are that people want to see done in the long term. There we see a very familiar set of things: the economy, education, healthcare. These are had kind of been the top three for years, actually, leading up to when the economy got really strong. And even then, education and healthcare were right there. A couple other notes that you'll see reflected as we work through. The people that are dealing with the most severe impacts of COVID are also supportive of the most kind of robust response. And you'll see that there are gaps in terms of how strongly different demographic groups and groups that have been impacted by COVID, how strongly they support various response measures. And we also saw, because we were able to do these oversamples, that Black and Latino voters are more supportive of a number of the priorities that we explored in this poll. So there's differences there, but then there's also areas where there's a lot of similarity, like which revenue sources draw the highest support. There's not much kind of daylight there. And even the general philosophical framework that Black and Latino voters are applying to the question of taxes is very similar with what white voters are saying. There's broad agreement that in terms of who's paying too much, who's paying the right amount, who's paying not enough. We see that there's a view that upper income residents are not paying enough in taxes. This includes upper income residents who feel the same way. We see a pretty high support for the so-called millionaires tax or fair share, the 4% surtax on incomes over $1 million. We see that reflected in the number one priority when we just ask how voters are thinking about these questions, where the highest priority is fairness, basically making sure everyone's paying the right amount. There's less support for some of the broad-based taxes we asked about. So think here like gas tax, sales tax, income tax, and so forth. But there also is still this perception that Massachusetts is taxpayers pay more than they do in other states, even though most rankings kind of put us about in the middle when it comes to individual tax rates. So we're going to look at some of the specific numbers in terms of taxes and support for policy. But before we get into that, just given what's going on today, I wanted to start with one particular set of numbers in the poll, and that is approval ratings. We here in Massachusetts really strongly approve of our state leadership. We approve of Governor Baker, which I think everybody knows who's been following his polling. But this poll also found that there's a high level of approval for the state legislature. 65% is higher than any number that we've seen since we've been doing polling on the state legislature. And it's just a high number no matter what person or thing or group you're talking about. So I think we can take some comfort in this and kind of see this is in contrast to the things that are drawing national headlines these days. It's nice to be in a state where voters feel good about the people who are in charge at the state level. So then looking at some of the specific numbers from the poll, we start off with things on economic impacts. And the reason for that is because these play a role in shaping the numbers that then go through the rest of the poll. So basically we broke respondents into 4 groups based on things that had happened to them during the course of the pandemic. Had they lost a job, lost wages, been furloughed, gotten food assistance, and so forth. And you can see then that if one of these things had happened to you, that's basically you'd had some negative impact from the pandemic. If 2, then you're in the more category. And if 3, then you're in the most negative impacts category. And there were some people that had almost all or all of these things happen to them. But basically the idea was we wanted to be able to look at who had experienced the worst of the pandemic and explore then how that shaped responses to questions of what the state should be focused on and how they should go about paying for it. So one of the things we've seen going all the way back to the beginning of the pandemic, it happened right away in our very earliest polling, is that COVID has had very different impacts on different groups of people. So we then broke out these numbers by demographic groups to see who's had 2 or more of those things that we just looked at on the previous slide happen to them personally. And that's what the chart on the right-hand side of this this slide shows. So 43% of people making under 25,000 a year say that 2 or more of those things have happened to them. And you can see that that's a lot more than the percent of people in the 150K plus category. So basically, the simple way to read that is the impacts have been much worse on lower income people than they have been on people in households with higher levels of income. The impacts have also been much worse on young people. That's another thing we saw happen right away. And you can kind of think about the situation that young people are in, and it makes pretty immediate sense when you think they're more likely to be renters, they're more likely to have part-time jobs, hourly jobs, less savings, all of those things that basically leave them more vulnerable and exposed to the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. We also see the impact has been worse on women, and as we'll see on the next slide, it's been worse particularly on women of color, and has been worse overall on Black and Latino residents, as the bottom set of bars there shows. Because we were able to do these oversamples, we can also then break it out a little bit further. And here we see that looking first at the bottom set of bars there, that the impact has been worse on women of color than it has been on almost anybody else, on almost any other demographic group in the entire poll. And we also see basically an education split where Black and Latino voters without college degrees were more likely to suffer disproportionate impact than were Black and Latino voters with college degrees. So the reason that I wanted to start with that is because it kind of shapes a lot of, or some of the things that we're looking at throughout the rest of the poll. So then starting to look at the questions of what voters want legislators to do. We start off with the long term. And what this question was basically how important people think that each one of these priorities should be over the next few years. And you can see that at the top, we've got 66% calling the goal of lowering the cost of healthcare a very important goal. 60% for access to healthcare. So again, healthcare right at the top, education right at the top. These are very familiar things for us to kind of see right up there. We also see skills training right there at the top, an economic issue. And then housing costs is another one which we've seen kind of climbing the list over the last number of years. Looking then at the bottom of the chart for a particular reason, we see investing in communities of color and increasing state contracts with women and minority-owned businesses. Now, the reason that I wanted to take note of how those break down overall is because then when we look at the next slide, what we did here was we broke it out by white voters, and then we also looked at the views of Black and Latino voters. And start again down there at the bottom with investing in communities of color and increasing state contracts with women and minority-owned businesses. And yes, overall, you see 35% calling those priorities very, very important. But then look at the gap between the percent of white voters versus Black and Latino voters who identify that as very important. Huge gap, 25 points between white voters and Latino voters, over 30 points between white voters and Black voters. We're seeing similar, perhaps slightly smaller, but very large gaps also as you kind of work your way up the list. Investing in communities of color, huge gap. Increasing opportunities for home ownership, another big gap. And you kind of work your way up the list. At the top, there's a lot of agreement, the idea of lowering the cost of healthcare, increasing access to healthcare, K-12 education, on all of these things, there's much more agreement. But you can get the sense that Black and Latino voters are expressing support for a much broader agenda than what white voters are expressing when you look at it outlined in this chart. So then how about more immediately? This slide then looks at some of the more immediate emergency measures that could help those hardest hit by COVID-19. And you see the strongest level of support for these immediate measures, these kind of emergency funding measures for COVID testing and vaccination. We also see emergency paid sick time. We'll see how this was phrased on the next slide. Support for housing payments is also right up there. And public transportation is the other one where a majority say, or about half, a slight majority say that they strongly support an emergency measure to help fund public transportation. I should also note that the items at the bottom, it's not like people oppose them. There's, on each one of these items, there was majority support. It's just the top items drew a higher percent who said that they strongly supported this particular emergency funding measure or emergency measure. So you'll recall that we broke things out by how much impact people had experienced. And I wanted to show this chart because this shows the difference, like how different was your support level? How different was your strong support level based on how much you personally had experienced? And the darkest set of bars there, the ones on the right of each set, shows the group that had experienced the most negative impact and how many of them strongly supported, for instance, 10 days of paid sick time. 75% of those who had the most negative impact supported 10 days of emergency paid sick time. 64%, the next set of bars over, the kind of the middle one, supported basically emergency housing funding. And you can see that that percent who strongly support those things tapers off as you get more towards the people who have not experienced any particular economic impact. Looking at the far left set of bars, there's not a real big difference in terms of funding for COVID testing and vaccination. There's no real disagreement or difference in the idea that that needs to be done. But when you're looking at the next set of things, there is really, the people who have kind of experienced the most of it are most likely to say they strongly support these measures. There are also differences, again, between Black and Latino voters and white voters. You see that at the top, there's again agreement on the idea of emergency funding for COVID testing and vaccination. But then you kind of scan down the list and there you start to see some bigger gaps. You start to see, again, these 15 and 20 point gaps on things like funding for public colleges, emergency aid to cities and towns to help them balance their budget, 15-point gaps on, emergency state funding for daycares and so forth. So there's a lot of agreement, on the top set of things, but further down, once again, Black and Latino voters have a more expansive agenda than what white voters are expressing in these questions. We also asked about some specific things, some specific policy ideas that have been floated out there recently. We asked about the idea of making public transportation free. Here we found that, and what we did with this and the questions on the next couple slides is we basically asked half one question and half another question. So on this one, we asked half of respondents whether they would support or oppose making public buses free, and the other half all public transit free. The reason was we didn't want people to kind of trade them off against each other and say, well, I wouldn't go that far, but I'd go this far. We wanted more their unvarnished opinion about each idea. So the half of respondents that got asked about the question of making public buses free, 59% of those said that they would support that idea, 31% in opposition. And then the lighter pink set of bars is the idea of eliminating fares altogether and making public transportation free. And there you see 50% support, 38% opposed. So more do support that idea as well. We also then did a similar kind of construction with emergency funding for small business. We asked half just that, emergency funding for small business. And then we asked the other half, we kept going and said owned by women and minorities. And there you can see that in both cases, you get a robust majority saying that they support those ideas, but that support is higher at 84% for the basic question of supporting small businesses. Again, it's not that people oppose when you go further and say owned by women and minorities, just the support level, it's a smaller, though still large majority. We did a similar thing for emergency benefits for furloughed and laid off workers. We basically asked that question, extending emergency benefits to all furloughed and laid off workers who have paid state taxes. And then for the other half, we kept going and said, regardless of their immigration status. You can see that those who got the full question, 70% said that they would support that, the idea of extending emergency benefits regardless of immigration status, and 81% said the same for when we just did the base wording. So we also then asked kind of about the philosophical framework people are applying. Like, what is important to you? What are you thinking about when you're answering these questions? What should be important for lawmakers to be thinking about as they consider what sort of taxes should support spending in the state budget? That was the question that we asked people. And there you can see that the top priority, kind of tied for the top priority was making sure all taxpayers, include corporations, are paying a fair amount of taxes. And you'll see that kind of pop up again as we go through the next set of slides. tied right there though, or close to tied, is making the best use of existing funds before raising new taxes. A very familiar concept in our polling here in Massachusetts, that people are kind of holding those two ideas in their head at the same time. And then looking down kind of closer to the bottom, you see that it's not that people think these things are unimportant. It's just smaller majorities think that things like using taxes to discourage unhealthy behaviors like smoking, drinking, or unhealthy eating are important. So there we're thinking things like the soda tax, cigarette tax, and so forth, and putting a price on carbon was also down there. But again, 69%, even for putting a price on carbon, 69% say that that's important. So it's not that it's unimportant, it's just a smaller number call it very important in that question. So here there's more agreement. So we broke it out between white, Black, and Latino voters and compared that to white voters. And here we found much closer to agreement on in terms of how voters are thinking about these questions. There are some gaps, and I highlighted any gap that was over 6 points on this slide, but it's not these 20 and 30 and 40 point gaps that we were seeing earlier on. Overall, there's agreement in terms of how voters are thinking about what's important and what lawmakers should be kind of thinking about as they're identifying revenue sources to pay for state needs. Another dynamic that's very familiar here in Massachusetts is the question of whether or not our taxes are higher than they are in most other states, lower, or about average. We looked up some rankings as a part of preparing for this presentation and found that we're still somewhere in the 20s. Depends on what ranking you look at and exactly how you calculate it, but we're kind of somewhere in the middle of the pack. But nonetheless, 55% think that our taxes are higher here than they are in most other states. And we found that that view is particularly prevalent among white voters, where 59% think that. While when you look over at Black and Latino voters, many more of them say that we're probably more about average or even somewhat lower than other states. We also asked the question, this is something we hear a lot about in our focus groups, particularly the further out from Boston you get. Does your community get back more than they pay in taxes, or do they pay more in taxes than they get back? And found that a lot of people don't know. This is a question, it's not an easy question to answer. 39% said that they were unsure. But of those that did have an opinion, people were much more likely to think, I pay more than I get back, or my community rather pays more than they get back. So then looking at some of where money could come from or where money should come from, the first part of this was asking the question, who pays right now too much, too little, or who pays the right amount right now? The red bars that are sticking over there to the left are the percent who think each group pays too little. And you can see the two that stick out the most there to the left are 60% think that about upper income residents, 56% think it about large businesses. Then the set of blue bars there in the middle are those who say this group pays too much. And you can see that view is much more common when asked about lower and middle income residents and small businesses. Most people think that those three groups either pay the right amount, which is the set of gray bars there, or too much. So you can see there's a big difference in terms of how residents are interpreting who's paying too much, too little, or the right amount right now. And that plays out as we go through what revenue sources people are expressing the most support for. So an obvious follow-up question is, well, who thinks that? Is this something where it's, lower income residents are more likely to say that about upper income residents, or kind of how is that view shaped? And what we found was that upper income residents kind of agree with this framing or this concept. The percentages you see here are the percent in each income category who say or who think that upper income residents pay too little in taxes. And you can see there's almost no variation. When you're looking at people who make under 25, 57% say upper income residents pay too little in taxes. And that view really doesn't change much as you kind of go up the income categories. So very interesting question there. Now, of course, there is the question of, do you think of yourself as upper income? We no survey or no representative survey has enough residents with incomes over $1 million to be able to pull them out separately. But at the level of detail that we could look at it, there really was not variation in terms of what people think about upper income residents paying too little. So then looking at specific revenue sources, what we see here is that the three that draw the highest level of support, that's the blue bars sticking out there to the right, are a 4% surtax on incomes over $1 million for education and transportation. This is the so-called fair share or millionaire's tax. We also asked that to half of respondents and asked the other half the same question, but not specified for income and for education and transportation. Didn't really change the support level. Both are right around 70%. What we found in our polling over the years on this question is that it's more about fairness than it is about education and transportation. And that's been something that we've seen pretty consistently in our polling over the years. But overall support for whatever term you want to apply to this has been very robust and very consistent over the years that we've been polling on it. We also asked about raising taxes on corporate profits. That was the other one that had support up there around 70%. There were two that were somewhere in the middle, cutting business tax credits and incentives that 45% said that they supported, and raising taxes on investment income. That one was the one that got 39%. And then the bottom four, gas tax, sales tax, income tax, and then increasing tuition and fees on public colleges and universities. All four of those had pretty strong opposition in this particular poll. So we also broke out the 4% surtax by income level, wanting to see, again, is this something where kind of the higher up and the closer to that $1 million income level you get, the lower your support level is for this, and actually found the opposite. So basically what this chart shows is the percent support for the basic upper income surtax, and then the surtax for education and transportation. That's the lighter set of bars here. And you can see that there's not a ton of variation, but what variation there is suggests that support is actually higher, the higher up the income ladder you go on these questions. So very interesting kind of trend and pattern there as well. So we also broke out the support for these different revenue options between white voters and Black and Latino voters once again. Here we found a lot of agreement. So some of the earlier slides, there were big differences in terms of what the actual agenda should be and how expansive it should be. Here there's agreement. Black and Latino voters, the top four things are exactly the same as what the top four are for white voters. And you kind of just go down the categories and you can see that there's really not a lot of daylight. There's some, Latino voters were less likely to support the Fair Share Amendment, for example, or the millionaire's tax. But there's still majority support for basically the same set of things and majority opposition for basically the same set of things. So very interesting kind of trend and note there as well. So that is a very quick tour through some of the results. I am very much looking forward to your questions at the end, but for now, I'm going to turn it back over to Juana to get Ben's presentation started.
Thank you for that, Steve. And thank you to everyone who submitted a question thus far. Those questions that haven't been answered yet will be answered during our question and answer portion at the end. But for now, I am delighted to turn it over to Ben Foreman, MassINC's research director, who will provide us a further analysis of these findings against the backdrop of a growing wealth gap here in our Commonwealth. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you, Juana. Thank you, Steve. I'm excited to have this opportunity. I'm just having a bit of trouble pulling up my slides, but here they are. So this whole series that we've been doing since the beginning of the pandemic has been about, is this an inflection point, or how is this an inflection point for us to create more economic opportunity in our Commonwealth? Thinking the way we do every day at MassINC. So I thought, in terms of answering that question, it would be helpful to put Steve's findings on taxes and spending in the context of the literature from political economy. There's a whole body of science that looks at how much can you tax and how much can you redistribute. And it has its own Newton's laws of gravity, if you will, things that we know will always be true. So I think looking at these laws and looking at the trends in Massachusetts helps us kind of reflect and use Steve's data in the most informative way in terms of how are people thinking now and how will this thinking hold up as we try to adapt and move forward with an equitable recovery. So the first kind of law of political economy is that the more our income distribution is skewed to the right, the more popular it is to redistribute income. And that's clearly reflected in Steve's findings. People are clearly very comfortable with taking money from the top 1% and giving it to everybody else. And if you kind of look at the trend in Massachusetts, there's no question that over the past 20 or 30 years, the top 1% are taking home a lot more of the income in our state. If you look at the red line, that's Massachusetts, and the blue line is the national average. Those gray lines are all the other states. So since the 80s, we were in the middle of the pack, and now there's only 5 or 6 states, I think 5 to be exact, where the top 1% earn more than they do in Massachusetts. So there's also this interesting wrinkle in the political economy literature that talks about the Robin Hood paradox. And that is, the more unequal income tends to get, the harder sometimes it can be to redistribute it back. But that's not a law by any means. It depends on how government is functioning. And we'll get to that a little later on. Massachusetts has, without question, been spending more progressively, I think, over the past several decades. And that's largely because we're increasingly redistributing income through healthcare expenditure. Now a quarter of the state's revenues go to pay for mass health. That's approximately $8 billion more in real money, adjusting for inflation, going to healthcare primarily to the poor. So we're taxing and spending in a way that is addressing some of the inequality. But the second finding in the literature, which is really interesting, is that overall, when you means test like that, when you spend in a way that's very targeted toward people at the lower end of the income distribution, you don't reduce poverty, you don't increase economic mobility and narrow mobility, because what happens is your spending is more progressive, no question about it, but the overall level of spending is not increasing. And we see this in Massachusetts. We've increased this kind of looks at trends in different categories of the budget and adjusting how much they've grown or decreased since 2001. So you can see the gray line is healthcare. It's increased by almost 50% since 2001 in real terms. But every single other category of the budget has declined. Everything else has fallen, including education, which is down by about 20%, including housing, which is down by 20%. So if you think about what is really going to add up to economic mobility for residents of Massachusetts, healthcare is important, if we want to close opportunity gaps. But we can't do it without providing the resources that students need to succeed in the 21st century knowledge economy. We certainly can't do it without providing the housing stability and a housing market that's ever more difficult for low-income people to find stable housing. And so there's real questions about state government, especially, ability to rise all boats when it's trying to distribute funds increasingly in a more progressive manner. I know that sounds odd, but I think it's important for us to internalize, appreciate, and strategize around it. We'll keep coming back to that. Another important finding, which gets right to sort of public opinion research, is that people's personal opinions about access to opportunity and how equal the society is, how level the playing field we offer is really determinative of how they're going to feel about taxing and redistributing wealth. And I think on this front, obviously, I think Steve's polls consistently show that people want to see more money spent on education, particularly for low-income students. But at the same time, I don't think we're fully aware at the level of unequalness in the playing field currently in Massachusetts. I think that the clearest indication of that comes from, I'm just going to skip to this, data that John Pape presented and we've shared before, looking at students based on their MCAS scores and the likelihood that they earn a four-year college degree. And even at the 99th percentile, the most gifted students in the state, there's a 20 percentage point gap in their ability to complete a four-year degree. And we know that's probably the most important measure of whether they'll experience economic mobility and whether we're narrowing inequality in Massachusetts. So there's clearly a real problem in the higher education pathway. And this doesn't even get to the fact that most low-income students aren't earning the same MCAS score as as their peers, all else being equal. I'll just go back to this slide now that talks about how economic inequality leads to greater economic segregation. This is a really important problem. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. As you have more and greater economic inequality in the state, people sort themselves by neighborhood more. We see the share of people who are living in sort of middle income, mixed income neighborhoods in Massachusetts has declined by 10 percentage points in Boston, more than 10 percentage points in Boston, and 25 percentage points in the New Bedford region, even more in Springfield. This economic sorting by neighborhood, we know, makes it much more difficult for low-income people who are trapped in high-poverty neighborhoods to experience economic mobility. It also means that we don't have information about what's happening to others in our community. We can't sympathize, appreciate at all with their lived experience and their lack of access to opportunity. So to the point about democracy, in an ideal world, inequality is self-correcting in a democracy because people will come together and fix it. I think the founders, if you go back to the Federalist Papers and you read Madison, this was probably one of their biggest concerns. And in some ways, they were concerned that there would be too much self-correction, that people would come with pitchforks and take the land away from all the landed folks. So they designed the democracy to disenfranchise all sorts of people. They didn't want too much democracy. We, since then, rightfully tried to open up democracy and have a more equitable society. But there are definitely structural forces at play that are making it more difficult for our democracy to address inequality. And we put out a research report at the end of 2019 that looked at some of these. One of them that we're particularly concerned is just the lack of information about what's happening in state and local policymaking today and who it's benefiting. Part of this is because the press has all but disappeared. To the extent that it exists today, it's behind a paywall and many people don't have access to it. And these numbers were pre-pandemic, and we know of all the sectors that have been hit hard, local news media has been particularly challenged to generate revenues and keep reporters on the beat. The other problem is people aren't running for elected office and bringing information directly to the voters and challenging those who hold office today. We're near historic lows in terms of challengers and Democratic primaries for state legislative seats in Massachusetts. For Republican primaries, they're all but uncontested. The loss of a competitive two-party system is a huge problem. We talked about this in depth in our research on this, especially for numerical minority populations. If you don't have two coalitions competing for their votes, they're going to tend to be more and more underrepresented in public policy making. And we have real issues with representation of minorities or people of color in Massachusetts in state policy making conversations. People of color are now almost a third of the Massachusetts population, but they represent just 13% of Massachusetts legislators and only 5% of legislative leadership. These are the numbers that we did for the last legislative session. We've updated them and they haven't changed at all. Despite some reports about the body becoming more diverse over time with each session, that's not actually the case. It's kind of stagnated. And unless we have intentional policies that break down some of the barriers that make it more difficult for people of color to hold elected office, that's probably going to be true for quite some time. And it's particularly problematic that when people of color are underrepresented in the body, we don't take steps to make sure they're overrepresented in leadership tables. We have a legislature where power is particularly concentrated and people of color have very little voice at those leadership tables. I think one of the more interesting, somewhat nuanced findings from the political economy laws is that when you have an economy like ours, where there's high requirements for skilled labor and rapid industrial change, where you're needing different types of skills in the labor force all the time, businesses are particularly likely to side with labor and want government to invest in human capital. And I think we have seen that in Massachusetts. I think we're particularly seeing that at this moment, though. The problem is from a tax standpoint, the corporate tax burden in Massachusetts is relatively high. Steve mentioned looking at the data on state and local tax burdens in Massachusetts, and we're in the middle of the pack, but that's what individuals pay. When we look at sort of corporate taxes, we're much further down in the rankings, particularly when we look at things like unemployment insurance, which is going to be a real problem for businesses as we think about how we rebuild those deposits coming out of the crisis. So just a couple of thoughts wrapping up in terms of where we could go from here and how we act on this information in a thoughtful way to maximize opportunity for all. I think, one, when you go back to those trends about increasing economic segregation and sorting, that's a problem that we could take head on. It's even more of a problem in schools. We've had a lot of economic segregation across neighborhoods, but we're seeing even more economic segregation across schools. That's going to be the topic of an event we're partnering to co-host on January 26th. I hope you'll listen in for a more in-depth conversation on that. But there's no question that from a sustainable development perspective, if we care about the environment, if we care about traffic and congestion, we could have a whole lot of thoughtful efforts that focus on development, zoning, development of mixed income housing, housing for all types of workers. We've got all kinds of expertise in that in Massachusetts. I think we've learned a lot about how to do that over the last 2 decades, and we could really double down on that. I mentioned, just on the past slide, the business community and their role. There's no question that post George Floyd and the protests and all that's going on in our country right now, the business community, which really hasn't been at the leadership table in a lot of our communities at the local level, especially in a lot of years, there's real openings to engage them and help borrow their leadership to ensure that we have public policies that promote economic mobility and opportunity. And then lastly, taking the structural challenges that undermine the health of our state and local democracy head on. Steve's poll shows that people are pretty content with state government right now, but I think we need to ask ourselves, how would they know? We do not do a whole lot to bring transparency, to make that work open, to report on that work and ensure that we are producing the best policies possible and using the resources that we have in the fairest, most effective way. So I think, these kind of 3 opportunities are really important as we look at what are the makings of an equitable recovery for Massachusetts, and how do we make sure that as we build that, it's something that's going to be sustainable for the long term.
Ben, thank you so much for your presentation. And Steve, once again, thank you for yours. We're getting many, many great questions. Again, we encourage you to add your questions to the question and answer function in the Zoom chat, and we'll be sure to get to them. I want to start off with a question myself, Ben. I think you talked a lot about how taxation has been utilized as a way, as a tool to address the growing income inequality gap we see. It hasn't done the job we'd hope for, but what role does wages play in this as well? We know wages have been stagnant for over 40 years, while we've seen healthcare costs, education costs, and housing costs increase far more than inflation. What we see is that, the American average worker is really squeezed between higher costs and stagnant wages. Could we be doing more when it comes to wages, and would that play a role in addressing the wealth gap we see today?
I don't know. I think there's a couple of different ways to think about that. I think in this political economy literature, there's a whole lot of discussion about the role labor unions play in reducing inequality, and when they advocate for workers and when they don't necessarily advocate for workers. And I think we've definitely seen less unionization in Massachusetts, and to the extent there is unionization, it's heavily public sector. So, I think we can think about the problem from that perspective. The other way to look at it as well is, a lot of the increase in compensation has gone to health expenditure, right? And I think when you look at these data, the arguments for single payer systems become much more compelling, right? Because Steve's figures show everybody wants lower cost healthcare. Our data are showing that we're redistributing wealth through healthcare expenditure at the expense of everything else. And if you don't have other things that everybody enjoys for government, you have less overall support for government. So if we could take healthcare out of the picture and run it much more efficiently, there'd be much more resources to pay wages, to invest in other state programs, to have more generalized support for state and local government.
Those are great points, Ben. And I think you and I were discussing this previously, but when you look at healthcare and the fact that it's, one of the biggest burdens to our state budget, and you look at outcomes, when you look at the outcomes, right, the huge health disparities between people of color and people, our white colleagues, I mean, we really haven't solved our healthcare issue. Yes, people are getting access to treatment, but is it quality treatment? Does it take into account, social determinants of health that have a huge impact in terms of outcomes? And I think we're not there yet. Steve, a question for you from the audience. I'm noticing big differences in views by race in your results. Does this match with what you've seen historically?
That's a really interesting question. And unfortunately, we don't know a lot about that. And there's a specific reason for that, which I think is indicative of now of the moment that we're living in. So one of the things that we at the MassINC Polling Group have seen way more of just in the last year or so is interest in doing this kind of approach, doing oversamples like this, where we go out and we get enough residents of color, whether it's parents, for the education poll, for those of you who may have participated in that webinar, we did oversamples of Black parents, Latino parents, and Asian parents. Elsewhere, like this poll, we've done Black and Latino voters. But a lot of the polls that we did maybe more than a year ago, we'd sometimes do oversamples, but it'd be like once out of 20 polls. Now it's probably 75 or 80% of our polls we're doing oversamples for. And I think that there's a few reasons for that. It's people are more conscious of race issues. I think just in the last, clients specifically I'm talking about are more conscious of the way that every policy issue is a race issue. Education has, elements of race in it. And, state budgets, as you can see in this, there's enormous equity implications to this data. And I think that there's just more kind of awareness at the client level that being able to dig into that provides a picture that's much better and much more complete and much more appropriate on some of these issues than just looking at things like either overall or white voters versus the kind of awkward agglomeration of like everybody else or non-white voters or all the terms that have been used there. So we don't really know what some of these trends look like, and that's why that's the reason behind that.
And I would just add to that, Steve, it's a result of nonprofit leaders of color who have stepped up to the table and said, what do we need to do to play a part to ensure that the voices of, the most underserved are part of these findings and have contributed in significant ways to these polls. So kudos to them, because I think it's really changing the conversation. And as you mentioned previously, it's really giving, government an opportunity to understand the needs of people of color across the state. So Ben, a question for you. You demonstrated a chart in your presentation that showed that Massachusetts has, a really high tax corporate rate. We're 38th in the country. However, you and I both know that there are many tax law exemptions that can be leveraged. Do we know to which extent Massachusetts corporate entities leverage tax loopholes and the impact that has in terms of their actual responsibility?
That's a good question. I think my understanding is when they do those rankings, they include different deductions and incentives. But they try and do that across 50 states, so I'm not sure how well they do that, but I know they make at least an attempt to. And they probably do capture the biggest things that result in the most leakage.
Okay. Steve and Ben, this question is for both of you, if you both want to add up your perspective, and it's from Roberto. It seems like there is both approval of the legislature, but also a desire for them to do a lot more. Any insights as to how or why people hold these ideas at the same time?
Yes, that's true. They do definitely hold those two ideas at the same time. And I think that some of the approval, I think, probably is a reaction and a rally around the flag effect of like the pandemic and all the things that have been going on around the country, and an assessment of like, well, we have it better here than it is elsewhere. But that's probably not all of it. I don't think that's really all of why people like kind of express approval for what the legislature is doing right now. So it poses an interesting challenge of governance where we have, there was one poll that came out in 2018 that showed we had the most popular state legislature, and a lot of polls that have shown we've had either the most or second most popular governor. So there is a question of how you then create a sense of urgency and a sense of need to do something, or kind of momentum to do something when you've got leaders that are approved of. And as a leader, you could either take that as, I should keep doing what I'm doing. You could take it and treat it with caution, like I don't want to ruin these high numbers that I have. You could also look at them as political capital. Like, I've got a 70 plus, I've got a 65% approval rating. I'm going to go out there and actually make a big change with these numbers that I've got because voters are behind me. So how to reconcile those two? I don't think I have a great answer on that, but you could certainly look at it as kind of a philosophical challenge, or philosophical interesting question about kind of how you approach governance given the reality of those numbers. Ben, what do you think about it?
I guess I'm with you on that one, Steve. I just generally think that, with the nationalization of politics, we know where people's minds are these days, right? And they're not on state and local government, even if we had perfect information about what was going on. So I think we really got to get people to understand that the state and local things that happen at the state and local level are equally important, if not important, more important than what happens at the national level. And we need to be engaged and appreciating of where we are and how we can continue to do better.
We've also seen a pretty long priority list in other polls too. This certainly isn't the first one where we've seen this. We've done other polls recently where people have expressed interest in more action on climate change and more to be done on transit and so forth. So there certainly is a desire for more to be done, that exists alongside this general approval of the way the legislature and the governor are approaching their jobs.
Thank you both. This question is for you, Ben, from Mary Jo. The decline in local aid has caused a very difficult situation for many municipalities, aka our gateway cities. How best can the Commonwealth remedy this trend?
I think that's a good question, right? The local aid formula was not all that progressive. And in some ways, we protected the Chapter 70 formula, which was much more progressive. And I think, the question in our minds these days is, with the Student Opportunity Act, how do we bring that revenue in a sustainable way? I think, that gets back to the whole idea of the more you make things progressive, sometimes the less sustainable they are. But, I guess it contradicts that argument to say that we've general unrestricted local aid more than we have Chapter 70. In that case, we have done the right thing, right? So there's those considerations. But to Mary Jo's point about our gateway cities, there's no question that it's a real concern in terms of the implications that it has for them to provide basic services that are critical to the general health of residents in their neighborhoods. And a good example of that is the work we've just done recently on the digital divide. When you see that gateway cities do not have the libraries that they could or should have, that they don't have access to those basic literacy resources, that's just one area of general local government that isn't properly funded these days, and has really suffered from the cuts to general local aid.
Thank you, Ben. A question from Bill. Isn't it a bit disingenuous to imply that high income earners and those affected by the millionaire tax are the same? In fact, wouldn't it be more relevant for all opinions to know if the person is directly affected either positively or negatively by their opinion?
Yeah, we certainly would love to have a representative sample of people with incomes over $1 million to ask them this question. Unfortunately, it's just not a high enough percentage of the population for us to be able to included in a poll, but certainly if we could, I would love to break that, do that income distribution much more broadly. But the question in general there's kind of two questions we asked. One was the question of whether upper income people pay too much or too little. And there we didn't see any impact of household income on how people felt about that question. And then there was the question about the tax on incomes over $1 million. And there, unfortunately, again, we just don't have enough respondents to know like who individually who is answering would be impacted by that or that tax. So certainly a fair question.
Steve, a question for you that as you were presenting came to mind to me. You were saying that there was a huge gap between your respondents of color and their white counterparts when you asked about investing in communities of color. And I think it was like a 25-point gap that you mentioned existed between them. And I wonder, do our white counterparts understand the historical racial barriers that have existed in this country that have, one, led to greater opportunity for them in very substantial ways, and which have also really determined the way we distribute income and wealth in this country? And not being aware of that, I wonder if that really sways their response to that question.
Yeah, that's a great question, and one I would even I mean, we didn't really explore that particular thing in this poll. I'd say certainly, academic research out there suggests that how to put it delicately, that understanding is not complete. We'll put it that way. But it was, I think, very illuminating to be able to kind of break out and see that those differences exist, where you've got something where if you just look at like, here's what all voters think, it's down at the bottom. But then when you do break it out, it's not, it just paints a completely different picture. So I think that, yes, there probably is something, there are historical elements like that probably play into it. I don't know exactly how that, what level of influence that versus other factors has, just because we didn't kind of explore that issue in this particular poll. But there's no doubt, I think that has some level of influence. It's a difference in experience. It's a difference in what you yourself have experienced, and that obviously plays a big role in informing your opinions. And that also, I think, gets us back to something that MassINC's research on representation in the State House and why that's so important. If you don't have that experience, if the people that are talking to you don't have that experience, the people in your district don't have that experience, you're just going to hear different things. You're going to understand different things. You're going to know different things. So it also, everything that Ben was talking about representation just plays so strongly into, why these differences are so important.
Could not agree more.
The literature on political autonomy speaks to that specifically and talks about how at a county level, the more diverse a county becomes, the less support there is for general welfare spending in the county. We see this a lot in school districts. As the school district becomes more diverse, often a community becomes more diverse at the school district first and then the larger community. And so you see less support for school spending. And that's one of the problems, frankly, we've had in a lot of our gateway cities is you have all white school committees and communities where the vast majority are students of color. And it's really making it difficult for them to be well resourced. And I think that's, trying to get at that structural change and make sure those leadership tables are becoming more diverse as the community becomes more diverse, rather than there being a generational lag is something that we've got to put on the front burner.
Yeah, no, I think that brings up a good point, and it touches on various policy. Ben, you and I, on the Mass Forward report that was released last year in 2019, this was a point that we discussed very much, right? If I'm a state representative for the city of Lawrence, one of the poorest communities in the state, right? Double the unemployment rate, and you're representing Newton, we have very different needs, but we're giving the same resources to be able to meet constituent services. So you see that across policy as well when it comes to the Student Opportunity Act. Great. We were able to get that policy in place, but did we do a risk assessment that really helps to inform what the needs are in a comprehensive way? And I would argue we haven't. And so sometimes when we implement policy, and add resources. Are these the real resources needed to address these social determinants and to address the historical barriers that have created huge challenges to economic opportunity for communities of color in a meaningful way? We have one last question. I'm going to wrap it up because we're close to time. This question is for you, Ben. When you were doing your analysis of healthcare, did you include federal reimbursements for Mass Health?
Yeah, one of those slides does include it, the one that compares our spending against all areas of the budget. The first slide was just the state spending.
Great. And that is our time this afternoon. Many thanks again to our sponsors, and thank you to a wonderful presenter, Steve Gazella and Ben Foreman. We appreciate all of you in the audience for joining us and for submitting your questions. This forum has been recorded, so if you have missed any of it, the full video will be available on our website, massinc.org, and you can find more details of the poll at the massincpolling.com page. There are still some of these forums yet to come, so don't miss any of them. Be sure to sign up and receive our emails. Again, thank you for taking the time to be here today, everyone. We look forward to when we can come together in person one day, but until then, be safe and well. Thank you.